Hi, my name is Dr. Catherine Hughes from Crime Psych. I'm a criminal psychologist. I have done a number of these psychological analysis videos in the past where I draw on research findings to give an informed opinion of what an offender's behaviour can reveal about their psychology. That isn't a diagnosis though, it's an informed opinion. In this particular video, I'm going to be discussing Dennis Nilsen. In all of my videos, I do try to focus more on the psychology of the behaviour, but sometimes there is a need to include some details of the crime. And I don't really like it when the media tries to sensationalise some of these cases and use words such as chilling or disturbed and so on. They over-exaggerate the facts for their audience. However, in this case, I found that I had to scale back quite a lot of the information, especially of how the bodies were disposed of in this case. And that's because those details were so disturbing. I will include the links to those resources in the video description, so if you want to have a read of them, you can do. But even this scaled back version contains some details of homosexuality, dismemberment, disposal of body and body parts, and a psychopath. As always, I'm going to give you a very brief overview of the case and the offender, and then I'll talk about their upbringing and childhood because that can still sometimes offer us some valuable insights. Then I'll discuss how their behaviour reflects psychological aspects of the offender as well as any psychiatric or mental illnesses. As always, if you do want to learn more about the psychology of crime and criminal behaviour, there is a link to my website where there are several online courses that you can choose to take. Some of these videos are free and some of them are paid. Most of the free ones have now had their content upgraded but are still free, so take a look at them. Dennis Nilsen is a Scottish serial killer who murdered at least 12 young men and boys between 1978 and 1983 in London. He was convicted of 6 counts of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. Nilsen was sentenced to life imprisonment on the 4th of November 1983 with a recommendation that he serve a minimum of 25 years. That recommendation was later changed to a whole life tariff though. Nilsen lured people back to his home and then killed them, mostly by strangulation or by drowning. He's also a necrophiliac and he spent some time with the bodies of his victims, washing, dressing, posing and masturbating with them. He claims to have killed many more men, which is entirely possible. He targeted those victims who were vulnerable through homelessness, drug use, intoxication, and some of his victims have never even been identified. If you've seen any of my previous videos, you'll know that I do like to take a look back at the offender's life and their childhood before they killed. Dennis Nilsen was born in 1945 in Aberdeenshire in Scotland. He's the middle child. His father was a Norwegian soldier, and after he married Elizabeth, Nilsen's mother, they lived with their parents. The marriage between Nilsen's parents was difficult. His father didn't view married life with any seriousness. He was often away with his duties in the Free Norwegian Forces, and he made very little attempts to spend much time or find a new home for his wife and children, and they divorced in 1948. Nilsen was a quiet but adventurous child, it's said. His earliest childhood memories were of family picnics in the Scottish countryside with his mother and his siblings. He also remembers his grandparents' religious lifestyle. He was closest to his grandfather and remembers being carried around on his shoulders and going for long walks in the countryside. Despite only being 5 years old at the time, Nilsen vividly recalled these walks as being very long. He later described that stage of his childhood as one of contentment, and his grandfather being his great hero and protector, adding that whenever his grandfather was at sea away as a fisherman, life would be empty until he returned. On the 31st of October 1951, while fishing in the North Sea, his grandfather died of a heart attack at the age of 62. The body was brought ashore and returned to the family home prior to the burial. Nilsen said that his most vivid childhood memory was his mother weeping and asking him if he wanted to see his grandfather, which he did. As Nilsen looked at the body, his mother told him that his grandfather was sleeping and said that he'd gone to a better place. After they'd moved out of his grandparents' house, his mother remarried and had 4 more children. When Nilsen reached puberty, he realised that he was homosexual. Because it wasn't accepted at that time by society and certainly not by religious groups and figures, he kept his homosexuality a secret. Because many of the boys to whom he was attracted had facial features which were similar to those of his younger sister, Sylvia, on one occasion he sexually fondled her, believing that his attraction towards boys might be a manifestation of the care that he felt for her. On one occasion, he also caressed and fondled the body of his older brother when he slept. And as a result of that, his brother began to suspect that Nilsen was gay and regularly belittled him in public, referring to him as hen, which is a Scottish dialect for a girl. Nilsen initially believed that his fondling of his sister might have been evidence that he was bisexual. Now this just indicates to me that he felt lost and confused while he was growing up. The only father figure that he'd been able to connect with had died. He was confused about his sexuality and he felt it was a shameful secret that he had to keep. Unfortunately, this was the same for anyone who was homosexual growing up at that time. Homosexuality was a criminal offence in Scotland until 1981. At the age of 14, he joined the Army Cadet Force and then went on to join the army, and he trained as a chef. He kept his sexual orientation hidden and he wouldn't ever shower with the other men in case he got an erection. On one occasion in the army, Nilsen and a German drank themselves into a stupor. When Nilsen awoke, he found himself on the floor of the German's flat. No sexual activity had occurred, but this incident fueled Nilsen's sexual fantasies, which initially involved his sexual partner, who'd be a slim young male, completely passive. These fantasies gradually evolved into his partner being unconscious or dead. On several occasions, Nilsen also made tentative efforts to have himself sexually interfered with by one of his colleagues. In these instances, whenever he and his colleagues drank to excess, Nilsen would pretend that he was inebriated in the hope that one of his colleagues would make sexual use of his supposedly unconscious body. Whilst he was serving in the army in a prison in Yemen, Nilsen was kidnapped by an Arab taxi driver who beat him unconscious and then placed him in the boot of his car. When he was dragged out of the boot of the taxi, Nilsen grabbed a jack handle and knocked the taxi driver to the floor before beating him unconscious. He then locked the man in the boot of the taxi. Nilsen had his own room while he was stationed there, and that allowed him to masturbate to his fantasies. They were all based on passive, unconscious or dead men. This is where he began his attraction to necrophilia. Nilsen would masturbate while looking in the mirror, which was angled so that it would look like another man. Nilsen alternately envisaged himself as being both the domineering and the passive partner in these fantasies. In Nilsen's most vividly recalled fantasy, a slender, attractive young blonde soldier who'd been recently killed in battle is dominated by a faceless, dirty grey-haired old man who washed his body before engaging in intercourse with the body spread eagle. After Nilsen left the army, he moved to London and he briefly worked as a policeman there. In 1973, Nilsen began frequenting gay bars and he engaged in several liaisons with men. He said that he found these encounters soul-destroying and he yearned for a long-term relationship. His birth father died, leaving each of his 3 children £1,000. After another relationship had failed, Nilsen thought of himself as being unsuitable for the police because of his homosexuality, and therefore he resigned. He then worked as a security guard and then as a civil servant. It appears to me that he was a deeply saddened man who felt as though he didn't fit in anywhere. He'd enjoyed the solitary walks with his grandfather as a child. He enjoyed the structure and the camaraderie of the army, but even then he felt like he didn't fully fit in because of his sexuality. The same was true of his job as a policeman. He'd developed fantasies of passive or dead young men and found the idea sexually exciting. He'd had several sexual encounters but didn't find anyone to be in a long-term relationship with and possibly felt as though that he was a failure. I've included all of this background information so you can see just how disconnected he became and how lonely he was, which enabled his paraphilia to develop. All of Nilsen's behaviours during his murders simply reflect the need to feel close to someone. There could possibly be a link between the seen as dead grandfather, who was the only person that he was close to, laying dead, and an understanding that he'd gone to a better place. We'll never know for sure. In fact, I'm sure Nilsen probably isn't even aware of the reasons why he did it either. The majority of Nilsen's victims were homeless or gay men, others were heterosexual men, which he typically met in bars or on public transport or, on one occasion, outside his home. All of Nilsen's murders were committed inside the 2 North London addresses where he'd lived at the time. His victims were lured to these addresses through offers of shelter or alcohol. He killed most of his victims by strangulation, with some kind of ligature usually. If they didn't die from the strangling, he then drowned them in the bathtub or in a bucket. He then bathed, clothed and kept the bodies for some time before dismembering them. Each of his victims, killed between 1978 and 1981 at his Cricklewood residence, was disposed of via burning on a bonfire. Prior to their dissection, Nilsen removed their internal organs, which he disposed of either beside a fence, behind his flat, or close to a park where he lived. The victims killed in 1982 and 1983 at his Muswell Hill residence were retained at his flat, with their flesh and some smaller bones being flushed down the lavatory. Nilsen admitted to engaging in masturbation as he viewed the nude bodies of several of his victims, and to have engaged in sexual acts with 6 of his victims' bodies, but was adamant that he never penetrated any of his victims. Nevertheless, he was sexually excited by their lifeless bodies. There could be a number of different reasons for this. He saw himself as a failure in relationships, but by killing men, they were his and they couldn't leave him. That might be why he engaged with the bodies after death. He initially stored some under the floorboards and got them out at several points. It was safe to say that these men couldn't reject him. Nilsen's first victim was 14-year-old Stephen Holmes. Nilsen believed that he was about 17 years old when they met at a pub. He invited him back to his home and they drank some and then fell asleep. The following morning, Nilsen awoke to find Holmes asleep on his bed. In his subsequent written confessions, Nilsen has stated that he was afraid to wake him in case he left him. After caressing the sleeping youth, Nilsen decided that Holmes was to stay with him over the New Year period, whether he wanted to or not. He strangled him with a necktie until he was unconscious and then drowned him in a bucket. Nilsen washed his body and lay him on the bed, caressing him. He twice masturbated over the body. He waited until rigor mortis had passed so that he was able to stow the body underneath his floorboards. After a week, he wondered what the body looked like and pulled it back out. His body remained beneath the floorboards for almost 8 months, as did all of his other victims at that address. In his writings where he reflects on his murders, he writes, "I caused dreams which caused death. This is my crime." And he added that he'd started down the avenue of death and possession of a new kind of flatmate. So he's telling us here, loud and clear, that he wanted somebody to be with him unconditionally. He dreamed about the possibility of unconditional love, but by killing his victims, he had a new kind of flatmate in his possession. And it was all about possession. He didn't want or need anything from his victims, so it was inconsequential to him whether they were dead or alive. Throughout this time, he'd had a few encounters with the police, as some people had reported him for taking pictures or trying to strangle them, but no charges were ever brought. He kept the bodies underneath the floorboards or other places around the house where he first lived. However, he was forced to spray the rooms twice a day to be rid of the flies that were hatched from the decomposing bodies. When neighbours complained about the smell, he convinced them that the smell stemmed from structural problems within the building. When he moved to his next flat, he didn't have access to a garden or to floorboards to hide the bodies in. He dismembered them and he flushed body parts down the toilet. That led to a particular neighbour calling out a drain specialist who discovered human remains. As soon as he was confronted, he confessed. He gave the police all of the details that they needed and wrote many notes and sketches about how he'd killed all his victims. A psychiatrist found that Nilsen was a manipulative man with some signs of mental abnormality, but nevertheless was still cognizant of and responsible for his actions. Nilsen shows signs of psychopathy in his behaviour. He's cold, he's detached, he shows no emotion or remorse for his actions. When he's confronted about his crimes, he's confessed in a completely calm and matter-of-fact manner and offered absolutely no resistance. Nilsen had a self-absorbed, self-obsessed mindset. He had an excessive need for power and control over others, and he had an incapacity to truly bond with other people. There have been many programmes about Dennis Nilsen, and I'm not too sure whether or not I've brought anything new to all of that. Nonetheless, this is an interesting case because we're able to examine the progression of disattachment, not fitting in at school, enjoying power and control, and that led on to exerting his power and dominance over other people. He never showed any remorse during his murders or his capture, and that's because psychopaths can't empathise with their victims. It was an emotionally vacant relationship that only went one way. And as I said, it was of very little significance to Nilsen that his victims were dead or alive. He cut body parts off, he removed internal organs, he pulled them back out after death to see what they looked like and on occasions to chat to them. Then, when the victims were of no use to him because they had become so badly decomposed, he burned them in his first property or flushed them down the toilet in his second property. I do hope that you found this psychological analysis interesting, informative, and that you've learned something from it. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.